A lot of my digital art students ask me, how do I shade things realistically? So we made this tutorial to show my process of digital painting. I'm going to be painting an apple, a classic still life object, but first I'll show you how to shade and blend a sphere using only grayscale to focus on value. Painting in full color can be difficult, so going back to the basics in black and white will allow you to focus on just the value, which is ultimately more important for realistic shading. I'll show you my process for shading and blending, and at the end I'll share my best tip on how to do it quickly without spending hours nitpicking the details.
First of all, we're going to be doing a sphere together, starting on a gray background. It kind of helps determine your values. Just drawing a circle, right? Doesn't need to be perfect. Leave yourself some room for a cast shadow. So we're going to be saying that our light source is going to be coming from the top right. The light source is important. The light source is going to tell us what direction our shadow is going to be going in, and it's going to tell us what area is going to be lightest on our sphere. So based on our light source, our lightest area is going to be kind of around this spot. Our shadow is going to be coming down around here. Because we're digital artists, it'll help if we actually mark it down first with different rings. So if we have our first ring here, this is kind of just generally where our lightest area will be. It'll slowly get darker, but there's going to be a ring of the darkest values right here. This shadow is going to be the darkest ring on the entire sphere. It's where the shadow gets the darkest. So it's actually going to be a little bit lighter down here based on the bounce light of our ground. It'll be good for you to kind of mark these down to start off, just in case if, like, you know, you've never really done it before, you don't really know where everything is. It'll help for you to kind of get a sense of what your shadows are, where they go. So at the very basics, right, if our light source is up here, this is where our light is going to be hitting. We're going to have a cast shadow down here. We're going to have our darkest shadow right here, which will not necessarily be black, by the way. It might be, but not necessarily. And then our lightest area here, which also might not necessarily be white. Because we're digital artists, the easiest way you can go about this is with our light source. You're going to pick your lightest value first, kind of just color that in. Find your darkest value here, put that on our Terminator line. You can pick your second darkest, put it down underneath here, and then get your third darkest, put it right here. We're going to worry about our cast shadow later. We're just going to be worrying about the actual sphere first. Once we've got that down, this is why it's nice and easy for us digitals, because once we lay this down, it becomes very easy to just blend back and forth.
There are different ways to blend digitally, but I have a very traditional method of blending, which is to constantly go back and forth between values and hues using the eyedropper tool until the blending is more gradual and natural looking. I do like to keep my brush strokes visible, but this is a personal and stylistic preference. I'll link a more in-depth blending tutorial where I go over the different types of digital blending, so you can watch that next.
And all we want to do is we want to make sure that the transition between all of these shadows that we've just put down is smooth enough. The fun thing about digital is that you don't necessarily have to make it more contemporary, I guess is the best way that you can put it. And what that means is that we don't necessarily need to follow by more traditional rules. So what we can do is, like, smooth shadows, not necessarily what's needed. We can leave in brush strokes, we can leave in texture, we can leave in all that fun jazz, right? And I personally really like it when you can see my brush strokes in my shadows or my blending. But the number one thing when we're working with painting our forms, that's like an absolute, is that if we're painting a form, you need to make sure that your shadows are matching the curve of whatever form you're drawing, right? So if we're doing the sphere, we need to make sure that our shadows match the curve of the sphere. You're not going to see like a straight edge like this while I'm shading in the sphere. You're noticing that I'm constantly curving around it as if it is like, you know, like think of it like a ball, right? It's a sphere. Spheres have curves, and we want to make sure that we have those curves in our paintings as well. Right, so once we have those values down, just kind of roughly paint it in. Right, so once you've kind of blended in all your shadows, notice that you can still see kind of the initial rings that I put down there. You still got your general, you know, light source right there. You see the area right here. It's the darkest portion of the shadow, and it slightly gets lighter as you get back to here because of the bounce light that comes directly off of our floor. There's always things that affect your shadows just constantly around, right? You're gonna have to think about when you work. It's the same deal with our cast shadow. We want to have it darkest when it's right up against the sphere, and then it'll get lighter as it goes outwards, and as it gets farther as well, it'll start to get a little bit more dispersed. So it'll be nice and sharp when it's near our sphere, and then as it gets farther away, the shadow will become more dispersed. You can see this effect. You have a flashlight or something, depending on how close or far away your hand gets from in front of the light source and the flashlight, the shadow will either disperse or be nice and sharp. So this is all we want to think about with our sphere. So we just kind of want to think of where our light source is. Remember that there's a terminator / a core, and there's going to be bounce light that comes off of the ground, right? There's going to be a cast shadow as well, depending on the direction of the light source. The light source is up here. The sphere is going to block the light in a certain pattern, depending on the shape of our object. So now we're going to move on to the still life. Keep in mind the things that you're going to want to look for. Based on that, you can identify it on your reference that you have. So on this one, there's actually multiple light sources. So this is an area light. We have it around here. So there's actually light coming from all directions. But I'm going to say that the light's mostly be coming from up here. So we have some Terminator shadows down here, and you can see the edge of it, which shows us the divots of the apple, right? The apple is not a perfect sphere. And you can see the light being hit on this apple immediately. They're nice and they're reflections, right? Because this apple is shiny. So our light source is going to be a lot more concentrated by comparison. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to sketch out the general shape of the apple. So once I have my sketch, which didn't take forever.
Some of my students ask me, Jessie, can I just use the eyedropper tool to pick the color?
I will allow you to color pick for you to get better. I don't necessarily recommend it. Usually it's nice to kind of just figure it out with your eyes. So when you color stuff in, you know, like if you've sketched on the layer above and the color is too light, then it'll look weird if you're using a darker color. So change that by changing your layer type with your sketch on it to a multiply layer. So there should be somewhere on the layer window that says like normal. It's like a drop down menu. If you click it, you should be able to change that layer type to something else. Multiply should be on there. And then once you change it to multiply, then you can color it on the layer below and then it'll easily blend in. You don't necessarily have to do this, but it will help.
If you'd like to support the channel and the creation of free arts education, become a member on Patreon.
Again, I'm not looking for perfect rendering. That's the thing, is what I'm looking for on this one is mostly just your understanding of the forms and the understanding of the shapes. Your understanding of what you can see when you're looking at it. That's the beautiful thing about observational, is that you are drawing what you see, not what you think you see. If you see something that's on there, you will draw it. As an artist, you can alleviate some of this detail. If you see something that you don't necessarily want to add in there, go for it. Right? That's more up to interpretation and more up to you. Fun thing about us being digital artists as well is that adding light and adding shadows is really nice and easy because we have layer styles, right? So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to play around with a few just to see which one I think is the best one in terms of what I want. But again, I'm working off of observation, so I'm working off of what I see, right? So I see a giant square of light here, so that's what I'm going to draw. Always refer back to your reference. One of the techniques that I was taught was just like, you know, always look back and forth, like 2 seconds on your art, 2 seconds on your reference, right? You want to constantly go back and forth and back. When we're doing observational, we are drawing exactly what is in front of us. So what is there is what we draw. So one thing, when I looked at my apple, I was looking over here, I'm like, okay, what do I see? I see this ring up on the top here. I see this ring of light that goes around. And I was like, okay, that's what I'm gonna draw. So I drew it on the outside. This light source is a bit weird. It's a square and it's what I have to draw. So I did it. There's a little bit of extra bounce light here, so I drew it over there. Don't expect perfection, ever. Don't expect perfection when you're starting. Don't expect perfection as you become a professional. It's something you grow into, and something that you get, you know, a bit more accustomed to, I suppose. One term that I've gotten so annoyed by, because it's true, is the trust the process kind of deal, right? The more you work on it, eventually it'll look fine. You look at, it's like, there's a stage of your artwork where it looks really, really ugly, and you're like, man, what am I doing? And eventually you kind of keep working at it, you're like, oh, this looks a little bit better now. So the technique that I'm doing right now is when you're painting or when you're working with your digital work, sometimes you'll find yourself getting hung up on details really, really easily. And you'll end up zooming in and you'll go like, man, it's like this section does not look good. It's like, I can't figure it out. This is when you zoom out. Do not stay zoomed in all the time. It will hurt you. This goes for any kind of digital art. If you stay zoomed in the whole time, you will be looking from one perspective and it really will harm your work. So it's usually better if you fix that by zooming out. And I promise it makes everything 20 times easier because you're not worrying about details as much. You're worrying more about the big picture rather than this little picture. You'll notice mistakes as well. You'll notice more things that you've done that's wrong. This apple is not the correct size. So these shadows that are down here, while it is also the cast shadow, these are also, in game artist terms or more digital artist terms, this is called your ambient occlusion. And ambient occlusion is your shadows that are caused by proximity rather than light source. So if two objects are close to one another, it's not going to be letting in light in regardless of wherever your light source is. So it's going to be darker than everything. So your ambient occlusion is going to cause shadows no matter what. So that's another source of shadow that you need to think about. So say if your arms are kind of like at your sides, there's going to be a bit of shadow between your arm and your body because you're close in proximity. There's going to be a little light that's going to be let in there, or like folds in clothes. So what I'm mostly doing right now is fixing kind of the shadows and the highlights that are on here. You know, don't be afraid to just add on extra layers, fix stuff. Again, exact, not what I'm looking for. So like if you just kind of add in certain bits, it doesn't need to look perfect, you know. I am definitely not going to be drawing every single little ridge of that leaf. I don't expect you to, if there's leaves like this, I don't expect you to draw in every single little bit of those leaves.
One last tip I have for you is to suggest detail instead of painting at all. This will make your piece look a lot more painterly and less overworked. If you stress about all the tiny little details in your piece, then it will end up looking a little bit too overworked, so you're better off just suggesting the detail rather than painstakingly putting it all in there.
Join a virtual class to learn live from our professional artists. Get creative assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork. Start today and level up your practice. If you learned something new, like and share this with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe.
If you enjoyed this video, here's a couple other videos you can check out next.